So we've heard a lot about communication, both from the regional forums that we hosted last year, and then in the branching out survey that I sent out earlier this year. A lot of people seem really interested in the topic. And so Brett and Hannah approached me probably a couple months ago now, and they were like, we do a lot of work in this topic. And they had this really cool idea for how they can share not only some advice, but also start a broader conversation about communication strategies and sort of the thought processes. So that's what we're going to work on today, and I'm really excited. I want to say thanks to Brett and Hannah a lot for volunteering to do this session. We also appreciate everyone who submitted responses to our pre-work poll that we sent out with the registration. If you didn't fill it out, no worries. We have a feeling the narratives are going to be quite familiar to everyone, and we'll also have discussion at the end. So before we begin, I just wanted to talk through a couple of ground rules or community guidelines. So both the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute and the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network live within Colorado State University. So I thought I would just start off by sharing our CSU principles of community. And these are just kind of some things to keep in mind as we engage in this conversation and really in all conversations. So the principles of community are inclusion, integrity, respect, service, and social justice. And then Brett and Hannah will also introduce a couple of additional guidelines for engaging in the discussion when they get started. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Hannah and Brett. So just for a little bit of background information, Hannah Brown is a science communications specialist at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. She holds a Master of Science in Natural Resources Stewardship from Colorado State University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature and Religious Studies from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And Brett Wolk is the Assistant Director for the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. He holds a Master's in Forest Science from Colorado State University, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Oregon State University. And the reason I'm starting off with a little more background than usual is because Brett and Hannah are really in this unique position to leverage their combination of both art and science degrees to support CFRI's mission of serving as connectors and translators between research and management in forestry and wildfire. And so they bring to us a lot of interesting perspectives and good expertise. So I'll leave it there and pass the mic to Hannah and Brett.
Thanks much, Katie. Yeah, I think these branching outs have been fantastic forums to have some good conversations, and we're hoping to have a lot of good conversation today. I think we'll talk for about half of the time and leave hopefully half of the time for a lot of good conversation and feedback from you all. So I'm going to do a little technology and share the screen. All right, we on the right screen?
Looks good.
Looks good. That's what I want to see. So as Katie mentioned, Brett Wolk. I'm an assistant director with Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University, here with Hannah in the Zoom square. I want to also point out Camille Stevens-Ruman is my the other assistant director at CFRI, and Camille will be monitoring the chat. So if there are some questions that she can answer directly in there, or synthesizing some information and passing questions to us, Hannah and I are going to be mostly focused on the oral delivery. But Camille is fantastic at helping out today. Here's what we're hoping to do. This was in the advertisements for the webinar today, is just illuminate some of those most common locally relevant selective science narratives that Forest Collaborative Network members have been saying they're hearing and want help with. Provide some tips on how we can all help clarify our communication in our own science application. And then, like I said, invite feedback on collaborative partners' experience in engaging in your own science communication. There's a lot of knowledge and expertise on this call that we want to tap into. A little bit about Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. We're one of 3 Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes that were authorized by Congress in 2004. We have about 24 full-time staff, plus an additional 20 seasonal student and seasonal staff. And our mission is really to be a boundary spanner between that research and management. And so we kind of have one foot in research and participate in developing science, but then we also have one foot in management, out in the field helping people interpret and apply science. People always have more questions than we can answer in the field, so we go back to the science community and say, hey, how can we develop more research and knowledge that's applicable to the decisions people are working on? And this is really sort of underpins our philosophy of that science plus collaboration leads to the actionable knowledge, that it's not just the science that tells us what to do, and it's also not just our opinions that tells us what to do. And where we succeed is when we successfully combine the both. So our webinar goals for today are to help you all on the call have better identify what is a fair question being asked of you from these forest and wildfire narratives. And then also conversely help us ask some fair questions of you, of the science. I think a lot of people are sort of frozen right now on how to move forward. So how can we ask better questions and know when better questions are being asked of us? And then just help us all sort of be mindful of our own language about how we're amplifying some of these narratives ourselves. And again, this is part of how do we be more intellectually honest with ourselves about blending the science and collaboration and the science and all of our experience working in the field together. And kind of reiterate Katie's expectations, engage from a place of inquiry, not of suspicion or trying to make your point. Our point is to try and help people today, and we're hoping that you come with that attitude as well. Share the air, take turns, and listen with an open mind for solutions, rather than, again, trying to dominate the conversation and jump in. Share acronyms and concepts, and that's where please ask questions in the chat right now and afterwards. And that's where Camille is a whiz. She can explain any acronyms that we might slip out of our mouths. And then really encourage all ideas count, even the wild ones. So if you have a thought, chances are someone else has that thought. And if they don't, it's worth sharing. We can't move forward if we just rely on the same talking points and same ideas we've had for the past. So principals, community, let's all get around the campfire, have a nice friendly conversation, and let's go. So I'm going to pass it over to Hannah now.
Ready.
You ready?
Okay. So I'm going to start it off with a bang. As communicators, we are all using the science selectively. And this goes sort of on a spectrum, all the way down to, like, on one end, straight misinformation, all the way into the process of peer-reviewed papers. And I would even tell you that this presentation has used science and scientific information selectively to construct a narrative that will be clear and useful to everyone on this call. So first of all, I just want to sort of challenge and break down a little bit the phrase, like, the science says. Sometimes this gets held up as kind of a pure and objective thing, but science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Tony Chang, the director of CFRI, has a really great definition of science as a structured process for asking and answering questions. And CFRI is a pretty pro-science organization. We would say it's the best system we have for asking and answering these kinds of ecological questions. We work to develop structured processes for asking and answering questions. We employ scientists who are actively involved in these processes around forest and fire ecology. And developing and using science includes constructing narrative. When we talk about science, it is also a narrative process. It has to be, and it should be. I want to underpin this a little bit with the philosophical paradigm of constructivism. And that is comes from a lot of like education and psychology literature about how individuals learn and understand, and holds that we do that through an interplay of new information with existing experience and knowledge. So in essence, people construct knowledge through their own views, beliefs, cultural context, worldviews, and experiences. Information doesn't just come onto you in like a blank slate. And so keep that in mind as we're kind of coming through this webinar today. We do this from when we're scrolling on our phones on Instagram and we see some sort of like pithy little statement that has a science fact. It also happens, through the process of writing scientific papers. Science is not immune from the same kinds of biases that exist everywhere. That means like confirmation bias, values-based distortions, exclusion of marginalized groups. All of these things exist within what we think of as sort of the upper tippy top echelon of the science. You also, when you're writing a scientific paper, place your findings in conversation with a whole family tree of citations and other literature to present and frame what's novel about your results, to present and frame what is supported by other science. And this is the conversational process of science. And at the same time, you're also, as an author, selectively constructing this narrative to create the best possible context for your story. So this is kind of the first tip for dissecting how relevant scientific knowledge is for your decision-making. Sort of what is the science finding of the paper or product that you're addressing? And second, what is the narrative of values that exist around the science finding? So when developing science includes constructing narrative, also incorporating science into action includes constructing narrative and agreement around the meaning of science. No one science can tell us exactly what to do or what not to do, especially when there may be multiple overlapping priorities. So, for example, what might be ecologically appropriate for a lodgepole forest would be a stand replacing high severity fire. However, that might not be desirable for other reasons, such as you have nearby structures. So science cannot be the thing 100% a fact that tells you exactly what to do, unfortunately. I really wish that it could be that simple, but it's not. However, we should be able to articulate how science and other knowledge has been incorporated into decision-making processes, what we think outcomes will be, what other factors contribute to our decision-making besides science. And we can also communicate and articulate about our collaborative processes that have frameworks for how science should be integrated into decision-making.
So what I'm capturing, Hannah, is science is a lot of Instagram clickbait and needs to be always contextualized, and it depends.
It definitely does depend.
But we use science.
We use science all the time. I don't want to scare everyone and be like, science is no good.
So why? So I think there's a lot of good in understanding, if you've never been through the process of publishing a peer-reviewed study or working on science, sort of the contextualization that happens with that. But here's a little why science is different than a lot of other kinds of information gathering. It is about that structured process of inquiry and accumulation of evidence over time. And that's really critical to sort of the scientific process, that science is not a set of truths that never change. It's this accumulation of evidence over time and over knowledge and repeated studies that use the systematic process. So science concepts, that's how they become stable, is as this body of evidence and knowledge accumulates over time. That's when we start to hone in on some of these things where we say, I think the science is getting a lot more clear on this. But the science is always an ongoing process and not a set of truths. So what science is right for you? There's a hierarchy of science within a strict kind of definition. And this is actually from a medical field, was a cool figure on the internet, right? And so you can think of, are there just a case study of one thing, is my opinion? Is it a meta-analysis of all the different things? And rather than thinking of these as really one is better than the other, I think what we want to come across today is there's a matrix of performance from an applicability of the science, where there's general findings of meta-analysis of here's what all of the things are saying. Here's what all of the things are saying about forest ecology across the Western US. And that's really useful for decisions that are applicable across the whole Western US. At the same time, there's very specific case studies or cross-sectional studies in this figure that, will the supplement X enhance performance of my marathon in hot and humid conditions when I am also taking caffeine? Will cutting down a few trees around this house on 603 Pee Wee Drive actually help protect this neighborhood? That is a very different question that when you take general science, those meta-analyses are going to be helpful to inform some broad concepts about what practices might be more effective than others, but it's not going to tell you what to do there. And a case study and gathering data exactly on that property and that piece of land might actually be just as informative about how to move forward. So we can find a research study to apply to whatever narrative and sort of make an argument why that's relevant. But really, I think where the crux is not all narratives and not all science really applies to every single decision. And they apply in different ways. And that's where sort of the science leading to misleading narratives is confusing this process of what information is relevant for different kinds of decisions. So I think that's the takeaway. I think, back to what is science is accumulation of knowledge. And there is a process for doing that. And that can look very different in different forms. And that can be in the form of a lab coat, doing repeated studies in the lab, or measuring the same tree in the same forest over and over. It can also be generations and hundreds and thousands of years of knowledge accumulation through peoples and different kinds of cultural learning. But that knowledge really accumulates over time in different ways, in different things. And that's sort of the systematic process is important in all of those situations. Tip number one, origins of misleading narratives, is when this happens, it's really easy to identify when these generalized science nuggets are localized inappropriately, or when this very local thing from Nevada is said, hey, we had the study in Nevada, we found this, therefore you should not do this in Colorado, or you should do this in Colorado. So those are some, an easy tip. You don't have to be a scientist to sort of start to identify some of these nuggets of science gold and how they can be strewn into misleading narratives. So our process that we're going to present through a couple narratives now is identify the nugget of science gold. What is valid and where did that science come from? What is this accumulation of evidence telling us? Then separate that misleading narrative from the science so you can tell actually what the science says and what the narrative and the positions of the people are in the narrative. And then also answer the fair questions. A lot of times we don't answer fair questions because we get so distracted by this misleading narrative. But almost always there is a fair question when there's a narrative being thrown at a conversation. This is really hard. This is probably one of the most hard presentations and prep that Hannah and I have done in our career so far. And I think you all and the Forest Collaboratives Network is feeling, right? Things are happening. Environment, people feel is being destroyed from a bunch of different angles and want to do something about it. There's exhaustion and frustration and just overwhelmed by all the science and data out there. And then you find some science in a nugget, but then you're like, well, it seems like no one's actually hearing my science nugget and it's being dismissed or ignored. And that's happening all over the place. So just in addition to capturing what the science nuggets and narratives were, in that process of listening and being a boundary spanner, Hannah and I have some therapy time in our position of listening and absorbing this, and just kind of share that lots of people are feeling this from all different angles, right? From all different angles on the narrative spectrum.
Well, so what should we do? What can we learn?
All right, let's learn something.
Level 1, citations. Don't panic. One of the things that can be very overwhelming when you're receiving a narrative is when there are just a bunch of citations on there, seeming to point to a lot of narratives that are maybe not familiar to you or seem selective. But number of citations is not always the most meaningful metric for, looking for that gold. Over time, you can begin to see which sources are typically used to support which narratives. This can be a pretty good shortcut to understanding the value system and the perspective that somebody is coming from. And then I also just want to highlight this paper, this Weston Bergstrom paper, Misinformation in and About Science. It talks a lot about the errors that science can be prone to and the ways that we interact with science can, facilitate spreading of misinformation. And one of the things that they identify is quotation errors, which is when citations are kind of misrepresented to justify claims that are not being supported in the cited documents. And so you can also think about your own family tree of citations and sort of just make sure you're saying what they really say. Let's get into some examples. Here's a narrative we've encountered in a couple of sources that keep coming up kind of in a Colorado specific context. So in a 2020 letter to Congress, 200 of the nation's scientists, citing recent studies, wrote forest protections and increased logging tend to make wildland fire burn more intensely. So let's talk about the 200 scientists letter.
Is there a nugget of science in there?
There sure is. 200 scientists did indeed sign a letter that has this sentence in it: reduced forest protections and increased logging tend to make wildland fires burn more intensely. And you have the citation that they've pulled from there.
It's a citation, so it must be true.
It must be true. However, there's some context around this 200 scientists letter that's pretty important. Would you like to get into this? I know you've thought about it a lot.
Yeah. So this objection, right? It's true. That sentence was in there and 200 people signed a letter that had that. The reason that 200 people who signed this is objecting to regulations that would classify forest products or wood energy as carbon neutral and open really large subsidies for forest industry and operations. And the reason that this was coming from a science perspective is the science is not clear that across the country you can make those generalized statements about forest products and wood energy is really carbon neutral. There's a lot of complexity of the energy it takes to harvest wood and then transform it into forest products. And yes, maybe if it's into 2x4 or cross-sectional lumber, things like that, it sticks around for a long time. But there's a lot of energy that goes into producing those, and particularly wood energy. If you're taking wood out of the forest and then burning it for energy purposes, there may be a lot of great reasons to do that are trade-offs versus fossil fuels or other energy sources, but the carbon neutrality of it is what the science is not clear on. And that's why people sign this letter. And the first paragraph of this letter explicitly says that. And that's what all the evidence in this letter was. So the narrative that has formed around this is kind of a misrepresentation of the intent of the letter and the weight of 200 scientists. That there were the 8 other paragraphs and all the supporting evidence is people were like, yes, this sounds good. And I'm sure there were lots of edits. I wasn't involved in this letter. But that's sort of just an example of, it doesn't take long. It takes reading the first paragraph of this letter to sort of get this context. And so how can you sort of then, it's highly unlikely that 200 scientists, can't say for sure, maybe all of them did support that one sentence, but I think it's highly unlikely. And so I think that's just, how do you reframe? And I think I'd like to hear people's thoughts afterwards. How can we reframe when people are getting hit with this? Because this was something a narrative that is going around a lot. So that's kind of a question, and how we want to help people throughout this process.
So here's another piece. This is the next sentence of this sort of misleading narrative. Uncut stands suffered the least damage from wildfire, determined another comprehensive study finding that forests actually burn hotter after logging. So let's do step number one, identify the nugget. This review indeed states that in this empirical study, uncut stands suffered the least damage from wildfire. Most of this paragraph is about how important it is to manage slash mindfully, and these studies found that slash resulting from logging is a key factor in predicting subsequent fire risk. So there's your nugget. Two, let's separate some of the narrative from the context of this science by identifying, the source context. And in this case, I would point to the date on this study. This is a synthesis and review of literature up to 2003 in response, again, to sort of an argument that logging would be a good way to reduce wildfire risk. And my takeaways from reading this study were that, tree density reduction is not enough to really reduce wildfire hazard on its own. There's other important things as well. And then forest restoration is not just about fewer trees on the landscape. So it really encourages a lot of complex thinking about these systems, kind of says we're at the beginning of the research. And just from that date and today's date, 20 years later, there's a lot more information that we know. And so, I don't have a problem with this synthesis. There's nothing wrong with this science necessarily.
Really good paper.
Yeah. But the context around the report is what makes its use in this case questionable. I want to say that it takes time to do this process, to get into all of these citations, and you probably don't need to do it for every citation you encounter. Instead, try our step 3, looking for the fair question in the narrative that you're receiving.
Yeah, so looking for those fair questions and reframing the communication and the narrative. Tit for tat, reciting facts back and forth rarely changes anyone's mind or brings, if we're in a forced collaborative network, bringing collaborative consensus to move forward on a decision. So what fair questions might a paper like this or these examples, can you articulate how will forest management actions actually change fire behavior? Because they're saying, and this narrative is saying that forest management is making it worse. So how is your specific actions going to change it? How will your proposed actions accomplish this goal? That's good. Let's get more precise with our language there, right? How are you incorporating climate change into forest management actions? How are you considering the climate carbon balance of your project? Is that even a consideration, or are there other goals and objectives that are more important for your particular actions? So really looking for, instead of sort of trying to dismiss things and talk your way out of it or recite citations back, there's some good fair questions in here that would lead to great discussions in our collaborative groups and collaborative networks across Colorado. So fair questions, right? Generalized versus localized inappropriately. How is the science being used, and how are your narratives being constructed? The currency of the relevance of the science and how old it is. There's some great old papers that are still completely relevant, but again, science is this accumulation of body of knowledge and evidence over time. And there's a lot of science going on now, and we're learning a lot more about our world every day. And then I think another one, again, you don't have to know the citations, but does the source promise a silver bullet? That's sort of
It's like a ringing bell, red flag, siren going off. If there's one solution, you should be looking for your selective science narrative.
yeah, and really trying to separate what is the narrative, what is the science, and what is the fair questions.
Yeah. And I want to just mention these questions are, I'm not talking, real scientists on the call, I'm not talking to you. Non-scientists like me, that's who these questions are for. So you don't have to dig into the specifics of like all of the assumptions in the models that are used. That's like, you know,
That's
not
like-
really a fair question for.
It's a
for
fair
you.
question for Camille.
It's a fair question for
Put some
Camille.
things in the
Yeah.
chat and ask Camille about some really technical model details, and we'll see what happens. Right, but there is you shouldn't get overwhelmed. I think we're trying to give you some tips of things you can do right off the bat and look to try and separate that narrative from the science to have productive processes in your collaboratives.
So let's practice a little bit, because this can be really challenging and overwhelming, especially in off-the-cuff situations. So let's go through a couple of examples and we'll dig in. All right, narrative number 1. Thinning in the forest doesn't protect homes and actually makes fire burn faster, increasing risk to communities. So there's no point in cutting trees more than 100 feet away from homes. What are the nuggets of science in here? So this first statement, thinning in the forest doesn't protect homes. What are some nuggets of science that could be used to support that narrative? On the left here is some resources from Jack Cohen. This paper is from 2000, I believe, but he's been saying the same thing for 20 years. That last link with that picture is from 2020. So a lot of his work and other work has indicated that home ignition is primarily due to the flammability of homes and immediate surroundings. And you know, that's why we can see, like in this picture, situations where you have green foliage, burned homes, because it's about embers and igniting home to home more than it is about wildland fire.
So if I build my home out of flammable material, there's a chance that it will burn down.
Correct. If you build your home as a concrete bunker, it will not.
Sounds
Probably.
like good science. I had nothing wrong with that.
Another piece of this, cross-boundary fires are primarily caused by humans on private lands. Fires that start on U.S. Forest Service lands are not the primary source of structure destruction. So here's a paper that talks about that. And yep, there's a nugget of truth there.
So I think there's a nugget of truth. This is where thinning in the forest doesn't protect homes. Let's be more precise about where thinning in the forest does and does not protect homes, and how and what situations it can protect structures from burning down or other values that we care about. And that's where some vagaries come in there.
Second piece here, makes fire burn faster. So here's some science talking about how if you reduce friction from trees by removing them, you can increase wind speeds. Nugget of truth.
Makes sense. I think that's nugget of truth. I think fire, there is some complexity and nuance with fire where once you get a large fire and a lot of energy behind a fire, it can feed itself and actually kind of move faster. Or there are ways that fires spread other than wind. Sometimes there are fuels driven fires, right? Where it is dependent on the fuels spreading the fire forward and not as much the wind. But if you have trees on the landscape, they are going to intercept wind and slow wind down. And if you take trees off the landscape, there is less to obstruct wind from blowing, and it will burn faster if it is a wind-driven fire.
Okay.
Sounds reasonable.
Does that mean increased fire risk to communities?
Ah, that sounds like a narrative question.
Good question.
And I think this is where separating the nugget of science from the narrative, right? Are these science things that if homes built out of flammable material can burn down, and reducing trees on the landscape increases wind speed and makes fires move faster, does that result in a combination of complex interactions? And this is the science plus collaboration and management leads to the actionable knowledge. Does that result in increased fire risk to communities? And I think we're going to walk through this one example to show a little bit of both sides of this. The one in Colorado that is most commonly brought up narrative that I hear is this buffalo fire in Silverthorne a couple years ago, right? This is a 91-acre fire, was the total size of the fire. Started right next to a community, burnt right into a recent forest management action where they cleared away the trees. And oh my gosh, people were shocked at how fast it moved through there. Maybe it's hard to say because we don't have a replicated study. Maybe less trees there made it move faster towards the community. But what that did is that allowed fire suppression actions to be more effective. So there was interactions besides just rate of spread that lead to, does it increase risk, fire risk to communities?
The
If you're
question of risk is
doing,
more complicated than
Yeah.
just one factor.
the narrative is more complicated than any one science study is showing, right? It's this accumulation of science and knowledge, plus how does it combine to play out on the ground? So I would say not necessarily that, you know, if there were trees there, maybe there would have been higher flames, firefighters would have been more hesitant to go in there, airplane drops of retardant might have been less effective, right? All of these factors contributed to the outcomes on this fire. I think we have another slide, right? So the nugget of truth, grass fires can move faster than forest fires, right? Mostly true. Misleading narrative, do they always increase risk to the communities? Sometimes it's faster than a fire suppression or other things can get there, but it provides opportunities and also the defensible space that we talked about and Jack Cohn talks about. If it's a grass fire, your defensible space is much more likely to be successful. If you reduce vegetation within 5 to 10 feet of your home, if you use, you know, building materials that are less flammable, even if it's moving faster, it's more likely that your home will survive those kinds of fires. So that's where I think separating that, acknowledging, yes, that science says that, and yes, this is sort of a nugget of truth, and really separating it from the narrative, hopefully can help move forward conversations within collaborative groups that you're working in. I think the flip side of this is this forest management project and this outcome has been held up as, well, therefore all fuel breaks work and we should cut the forest everywhere because look, we saved Silverthorne, so we should do forest management everywhere. And in this same article, there's a quote from folks in Summit County of, we're not gonna be able to stop every fire and fireproof the forest. I sure hope this narrative doesn't get out and mislead people that everywhere they see forest management, we're going to be able to save the home. And it's also, you know, this is elevated in the wildfire crisis strategy of the Forest Service. This is the national rollout of the initial pamphlet. And there's a picture of the same fire, right? Being held up as fuels treatments work. Look, here's an example. So we're going to do 50 million acres more of this because it worked here. So it's going to work where you are.
Can you talk a little bit about why it worked here?
Yeah, I think that's the flip side. This worked because, as I said, it was a 91-acre fire total footprint. And so you can see in this picture, it started just outside of where the forest management was, where they reduced the tree density right next to the homes. And it didn't, as we said, some fires are wind driven, some are fuels driven. This fire didn't have a chance to get a lot of momentum and energy built up before it ran into the reduced tree density area. If it started even a mile or less back off in that picture in more of the dense forested area, right? This is what we've seen through some of our recent fires like the East Troublesome and Cameron Peak, or even the 4 Mile Canyon fire outside of Boulder. And there's plenty of examples where 91-acre fires or roughly 100-acre forest management areas don't impact the outcomes of those larger fires, right? Because the fire has so much energy and momentum, it would go right over that. The size is a mismatch of the forest management and the fire intensity and trying to change those fire outcomes. So I think there's a lot of excitement. We should be celebrating this, but adding a little nuance on what kind of outcome did this change and what kind of outcome should we expect this to change in the future? I think that's where we're putting ourselves under the microscope and not doing ourselves any favor when this kind of thing is held up as the panacea of all forest management.
Remember to beware of all silver bullets. So let's get into step number 2. We're separating narrative from information. Brett sort of talked through an example, but what all of this narrative together kind of comes to is there's no point in cutting trees more than 100 feet away from homes. So what's some information about that? Yeah, building materials, building codes, important for protecting homes from wildfire. Work on private lands is important for reducing home loss from fire. Wind speeds can increase when tree density is decreased. A false narrative, not all forest management is geared towards protecting homes. So this sort of like opens the conversation and brings us more into these fair questions that this narrative asks us to address. What other strategies besides forest management will help the community adapt to wildfire? What lands need to be considered when you're doing this? It's not just federal lands, it's also private lands, it's also state, city lands. There's many geographies that have to be considered. Do you have a management plan to reduce fuels on the ground? On the flip side, some fair questions that we can ask of this narrative are, well, what other objectives can forest management have besides structure protection in the WUI? That's not the only reason that forest management might be undertaken. Also, what definitions of effectiveness are we using? Is a forest management action only effective when it can stop a fire in its tracks to protect homes? Is that the only definition of effectiveness?
So there's no point in cutting trees more than 100 feet away from homes. Completely flips the narrative to our only objective in cutting trees is to protect homes. And if that's your only objective, then go with that narrative. And the science, it says there might be some reasons to cut trees more than 100 feet from homes, but your best bet is as close to the home as possible. And that's where really challenging everyone to articulate what are your real goals and objectives with each project, and then linking those actions to your goals and objectives.
Right. And then we would maybe submit a potential shared narrative and priority and value. Forest management alone cannot solve all wildfire problems. We're going to need a lot of tools from a lot of areas of expertise to deal with this. And it's okay to articulate, where other strategies might be more effective to meet your defined objectives. All right, narrative number 2. This one's more complicated. It's about carbon sequestration for ameliorating climate change. And let me tell you, as somebody who is not a scientist and spent a lot of time digging into this, this is really, this is complicated, really sciencey stuff. So let's dig into a little bit, identify some of the nuggets that are supporting the narrative that preserving forests by reducing biomass removal is the climate-informed choice, and we should focus on addressing climate change. So here's our nuggets, a couple of them. This is the first one, is this study kind of forest lands across the United States that found that carbon losses from harvest are higher than losses from other kinds of disturbance. Over on the other side here is another study that basically is arguing that the amount of carbon removed by thinning is larger than the amount that might be saved from being burned by a fire, sort of saying, hey, that math doesn't work out. And to reduce climate change impacts, we need to maintain and increase climate sinks, especially in high carbon forests in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. So when you're not a person with a ton of expertise in climate science and modeling, like me, it can be really challenging to engage with these kinds of sources and the science within them. Like the modeling assumptions, the implications of the choices are often outside of our wheelhouse. And then like carbon math is this whole thing that like people are experts in. So in situations like this, I will say it's important to lean on understanding of experts in your collaborative partnerships. And also there are some good, fair questions that non-scientists can ask of these sources to find, some focus on shared values. And one of the ways we can do this, step number 2, separating narrative from science, is by adding some local complication to these wider stories. Again, one of the big sources of misleading narratives is generalizing information inappropriately or localizing it inappropriately. So what localized information can we find? We have this study that says, acknowledges mitigating wildfire risk through forest management guarantees carbon removal. Whether that math works out on kind of like matching that with potential for carbon removal from wildfire depends on how much fire exists and how much fire your management actions are encountering, and found that the more fire there is, kind of the more likely that that math is going to work out, at least in wildfire prone southwestern ponderosa pine forests.
But that math is probably different in Pacific Northwest or Southeast USA, very productive forests.
Yes. And then also additional context here, Colorado forests are a net source of carbon. Large scale disturbance is removing carbon, and our forests are really slow on carbon uptake.
Yeah, especially Colorado forests, right? It's cold, it's dry. The soils aren't very good for growing trees. So we grow slow, small, crooked trees. You all know that, right? And really it's about trying to maintain carbon on the landscape in Colorado. And there's differing views, like Hannah said. If we're gonna assume that more fire happens, then doing forest management so that we retain more green trees after a fire is a strategy. With carbon, it's also, we need to talk about time frame. If you're talking about a 300-year time frame, then let the full forest burn down and it'll all grow back. And in 300 years, we'll be right back to where we started.
Maybe. Right? But then see, we have other more localized science.
More?
I'm sorry, there's more. There's more localized science that complicates this even further, right? So this is kind of the like most local example I could find about like carbon sequestration in Colorado forests in the Wildfire area. This study did find that carbon was about 20% lower in areas that had been treated and then burned. And it also found that burns in treated areas look less severe or potentially have more rapid recovery of ground cover. The other thing we really need to consider is that in dry pine forests, these trends of fire, drought, and tree regeneration delays or potentially regeneration failure present a major concern. And that also has major implications for carbon storage over the long term. So questions that you can ask towards understanding this: what information is available that's more specific to my local geography? How might local science differ or support like large scale narratives? What are those more granular understandings and nuances that we can tease out? And then is there really the climate informed choice, or are there potentially multiple climate informed choices?
It's usually trade-offs. Yeah, so there's fair questions, right, that you can ask. The narrative asks us of just how are you incorporating climate change considerations into your planning?
Fair question.
Pretty fair question, right? Are there areas where preserving forests on the long term is your goal versus acknowledging and actually working towards regenerating new forests? And then questions you can ask of this narrative, right? Can this information help me clarify my goals and objectives? How can this narrative really help me be more clear in what I'm doing? Right? What geographic or time scale does this information speak to? Is it speaking to maintaining carbon on the landscape for the next 10 years? Because if it's really short term, and there are some good justifications for we really need to reduce our CO2 outputs to the atmosphere in the next 10 to 20 years, then that pretty much always points to retaining whatever vegetation we have on the landscape and doing whatever we can to do that. If you have a longer term view, the answer might change and differ a little bit.
But there's also a really great like shared value that we can pretty easily identify here. Like we share existential dread about climate change, what it's going to do to the landscapes we love.
Yep. All people and all these different angles and narratives we talked about. I think there's a lot of shared sort of, right, that climate dread and also the real motivation to try and do something about it. And I think we're crossing each other by doing these misleading narratives to try to lead to the outcome we want instead of actually talking about the science and trying to find solutions together. And that's where jumping right to the narrative sort of shortcuts the collaborative process.
So I want to talk a little bit about how uncomfy, like putting together this presentation and thinking about these issues over the last several months has been. It's been personally, professionally uncomfortable. Like I'll be like completely vulnerable and honest here. It's been a little embarrassing for me to look back on like confronting these places and products where the narratives that I've helped develop and helped share have not been adequately nuanced, and they've contributed to black and white thinking and simplistic messages often about the virtue of forest management. So it's really forced me to look at, where have I contributed to these selective narratives? And I'm going to hold up this like 2-pager that I put together pretty early in my career at CFRI. I'll put a little context around it, that it was designed to be like a paired piece with a staff profile where I asked members of our staff, what's one thing you wish that people would just know about forest or fire management? And this person responded to me with, cutting down trees isn't always a bad thing. So I went on my merry way and I wrote this lovely 2-pager about why cutting down trees isn't always a bad thing. But even in that title, even in setting it up in this way, like I placed this in opposition to another assumed narrative, and I perpetuated that sort of combative conversation based on narrative.
Yeah, identify the science nuggets and separate it from the narrative, and then let's find some, what are some fair questions?
Right.
So I think cutting down trees isn't always a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that statement necessarily. It's more how you represented it in the paper. And the science isn't wrong that you represented.
No.
It's really about our communication. And I think reframing our communication is what we're trying to help everyone be better at that.
Yeah. And so doing this process and looking at this has really prompted me to be more careful with my words and what they promised. This phrase, treatment to reduce wildfire risk, is removed from my vocabulary. Treatment, what kind? Wildfire risk to what? How will the action reduce risk? Am I overpromising with a statement like this? And, is this message even helpful, or does it rely on oversimplification and lack of nuance?
I think I want to run through some of this quick so we can get to discussion. I think we're running a little bit longer than we had hoped, but I think I learned a really valuable lesson. A lot of my career in forestry has, for better or worse, focused around mulching. I got into it. I got identified as someone who knows maybe something about it, and that narrative has continued, let's say. And I learned very early on, presenting some monitoring data before and after some mulching projects and saying, well, what you're doing is you're really taking a tree and you're grinding it up and putting it on the ground. And so no fuel is leaving the site. And that doesn't always reduce risk. And sometimes it can actually make it worse depending on how you're rearranging fuels, right? And I think the science still says that a lot. But the way that I was conveying that narrative and that message, it was conveyed to a group of people on advisory committees that evaluated grants across the whole state, across a variety of programs. And I wasn't very careful in the nuance that I was presenting that narrative to. And most of those people went into all those grant programs, and for almost a year, anytime they saw the word mastication or mulching, that application got thrown to the side and wasn't approved, largely because of the presentation of the science nugget that I had done without enough context. And I learned a heck of a lot about that, of engaging with people and how we're presenting science and the nuggets and the context around it. And that's why I haven't read it in a little while. I'm sure there's things that I would still like to improve, but this mulching synthesis was years after that experience and was a really great process for me, again, to learn from those mistakes and say, okay, let's put some more nuance around this message, but still concise enough that can be useful for people to digest easily and use in the field. So there's a lot of learning that goes on. And I think that's the core. Hannah said the core of CFRI is science, and we're a science-based organization, but really we're a learning organization. And I don't know why, but all these mistakes you're saying, and I've like given you raises and promotions, I feel like you failed a lot. I don't know why
all
that
the
happened.
time. I mean, like, but by failure, we learn a ton of stuff.
So I think our message to all is sort of, a lot of times we are perpetuating these narratives and inviting things within the Forest Collaborative Network sort of span of partners. And I know there's some people from out of state on here or registered for the webinar too. We're inviting a lot of this on ourselves with our vague language that sort of opens doors for people to create whatever narrative they want from whatever perspective they're coming from. And the more nuance and precision you can give on your own language helps close the door on potential for those other narratives to develop. So our rule, and this is some of Hannah's brilliance, is like, no, scientists, we can't know all the things.
Not every single person can know all of the things.
I know you do. It's great. But we need
Lies.
people that can do that, but we can't communicate that. It gets lost. And if we're talking to media or something, right, the message is always keep it simple, straight, and repeat the same thing over and over. But I think what has been great tool that we've used and Hannah's developed is take the simplest message you got, but you do need to add 15 to 25% of nuance to that message. Because if it's the bare bones simplest message, that's going to also be misleading and open the door too much. So, here's some examples of, fuel breaks save homes is the headlines, but fuel breaks allow firefighters to save homes. That adds a little bit of nuance to it, but it's really important nuance that just cutting the trees isn't the only thing. It's this combination of factors, right, that contributes to good outcomes that we're trying to do. So really connecting those outcomes with actions and narrowing those possible alternative narratives is the benefit of adding this little bit of nuance. So similar to the geography, be cautious about generalized narratives that are localized inappropriately, and then also localized narratives that are perpetuated as these generalized rules. Same thing with the science. You can use the same tools to identify narratives and move better. And I think we're improving a lot. I am really happy and impressed. And I think I saw, like I said, we haven't been watching the chat or who's on exactly, but I saw some State Forest Service communications people. This is a great campaign. It's clear, it's concise, it adds a little bit of that nuance. I think we're doing a lot of things, and lots of people are learning from all of our mistakes in the past. So there are circumstances where there's a huge benefit to all saying a consistent message. And I think this is one of them with this Live Wildfire Ready campaign. So how can we do better? Here's some tips to try and summarize it up. Separate the nuggets of science from the narrative. Identify and answer those fair questions, and don't be afraid to engage in that. I think when you say, hey, I'm glad you brought up this narrative and this question, I'd like to address it. And then again, start with your most simple message and just add that 15 to 25% nuance to it. Again, if it's a real balance, and that's why we have people like myself and Hannah at CFRI to balance out the people. You need the people that are writing code and doing analysis and writing papers all the time. We would be lost without them. But to get all of that knowledge distilled down to a nugget that someone can understand, that's that interplay of the science and management, even just within our communication. So
But regardless of all that science, you can't bring science to a values fight and expect success.
But I have the paper.
I know you do, but it's, as we talked about, and like a lot of research and our own experience, I'm sure we've all had that experience at the holiday table where that reciting facts does not actually change anyone's mind about their views. So it's rarely helpful to build consensus, to kind of engage in that dueling science, dueling experts kind of discussion. Again, science informs, but doesn't make all decisions. And no one person knows all the science. So don't have that expectation of yourself, even though that can be really challenging in an off-the-cuff situation.
I can go pretty quick through these.
Yeah.
Should we skip the next two?
I
I
guess
we've said a lot of this. I think it's reiterating, be honest with ourselves with the science. It's hard to keep up. And then enhance the precision of how we're articulating what we're doing. And really, I think, look for those opportunities that articulate how science has been incorporated in our processes. As a Forest Collaborators Network, that's your area of expertise, is the collaborative process. So how really stick to that and lean into that.
it's really hard. This is really, really hard to be concise and clear in situations where there's a lot of nuance. So we're going to have to repeat our messages a lot. But overall, we're just being called to up our game about our communication. And we can use these misleading narratives as an opportunity. This is back to that constructivism that we talked about in the beginning. And basically, disequilibrium facilitates learning, and failures and errors are really great opportunities to engage and to learn to do things better.
I think back to the beginning in our science plus collaboration and actual knowledge, you got to have data. Data in science is critical. Otherwise, it's just my opinion against yours. But we're swimming in data right now. And I think it's how you make sense of that data and the narratives is really the crux of how we're going to move forward. And really the blending of that is where the magic happens, but also where the misleading narratives can emerge. So we will post some resources and other sources. Katie will share this on the Collaborative Networks website. And I want to, and Hannah and I both want to thank you all for tuning in. And we'd love to hear how you have experienced some of these narratives in your collaboratives, how you've dealt them. Have you tried some of these tactics we suggested and already failed and want to share? Or do you have questions for us as well? So I think we'll open it up. Like I said, we ignored the chat and didn't have it open and haven't looked. So maybe I'll start there with Camille while people are formulating questions. Is there anything, Camille, that you've seen or questions that you wanted to bring up? It looks like
There's
not too
nothing
much
in the chat, right now, but I did have a question about how you I think this was great, but as a part of my hat being as a scientist, what do you think that the scientific community could also do to improve how these narratives are coming out?
Fair question.
That's a great question.
I think, continuing to develop science, there's a need for sort of basic science of how the world works. And then there's also another step of applied science and really making sure of differentiating if this is a basics, where your science is applicable from your perspective. Because no one knows the science better than the scientists who created it. Speaking from my experience, right? When you send a paper off to peer review, the peer reviewers don't know all of the details of exactly how you did things and what that means and put it together. So I think having scientists be more aware of how you're constructing the narrative, and like Hannah articulated earlier, of how you're building your tree of references and your context and how you're doing that, is really important for how that science gets out into the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say also, like, the ways that like science and scientists can interact in collaborative groups is like a very important function and role, because like that way, like the people who know the science best get to be involved in discussions about application. That's a great time to talk about caveats and questions that still exist. And it also builds trust to continue to integrate information kind of like within the structure of kind of a collaborative framework, which makes it much more powerful as well than simply kind of a publication and walk away.
Yeah,
kind of
I will say we've seen a shift in organizational structure. Scientists don't get rewarded generally for going to collaborative meetings and talking to managers or policymakers. They get rewarded for how many papers they publish and research grants they get. And so we've seen, though, and CFRI has been in this position where we're pretty unique, where we hire people, and like I said, we have 1 foot in science and 1 foot in management, but straddle them. But I've seen lots of collaborative groups where they integrate a science and management team or a adaptive management team rather than just having a science team. And organizations, like this, our Colorado State Forest Service has a science and data division that is embedded with all of the other program areas. And there's other organizations like that that have sort of their own science wing right embedded in it. If you don't have a big organization, developing those relationships with the scientists and finding some of them and giving them incentive to be a part of your collaborative group would be a good strategy. Any other experiences or questions people want to share? I think it'd be great to hear from some of you.
I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, there it is.
My name is Megan. I'm with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed and also do communications for the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. And one of our tools for communicating with the public is through social media, like pretty much every organization or business that exists. Social media is a big way that we communicate with the world. And I'm just wondering, how can we apply some of this to social media management and our social media policies for collaboratives like the NOCO Fireshed? And in it kind of getting at that idea of like, we don't want to participate in a tit for tat with anonymous people on Facebook. So how can we apply this knowledge to better communicate in those channels?
I guess I'll ask a question of you, and then I'd be curious to open it up from other folks who have social media for collaborative groups. But how do you think the framework we presented today of, even in some short pithy comments, trying to separate a narrative from sort of trying to make a scientific point, and then identifying, instead of looking at the vitriol and a lot of the sort of rage that can come out across social media, identifying some fair questions and using it as an opportunity of like, thank you for asking this, bringing this to my attention. Here's some information. Sometimes in social media, right, I'm not an expert in this, but then that's just going to invite more rage and more attention on your site. And sometimes it's better to just not delete it. I think that's a wrong move to do. That makes people feel even less heard. Again, back to the slide of all the feelings that we're having. Those feelings are happening of being ignored on all sides of this. And deleting posts or deleting information, unless it's sort of derogatory. But if it's just criticizing the work that you're doing, I think, deleting is the wrong way, but using it as somewhat of an opportunity and really separating the narrative. But I'm curious other people's experience engaging in social media where you've tried something, had success, had failure. What do you think, Megan? Could that help situations? Could you see doing that?
Yes, I definitely, this presentation definitely helps me, just thinking back to some of the comments we've received on posts of, I think there is some shared values and fair questions. And so, yeah, trying to identify those nuggets would be helpful. But then there's also just like complete false statements. And I don't know that that's the right venue to like have a back and forth. Of course, I wish I could sit in with the person and have a conversation, but that's just not always possible. So yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how, what the best use of my time is, and also just how we can incorporate some of this into our policies, like social media policies that we don't have yet, but that I'd like to have.
What
So
are the metrics that you use to evaluate, like you use number of views or likes or things like that to say like, oh, are people seeing what I'm doing, right?
yeah, I mean, you can always look at the analytics behind any post or any profile. I don't know that that necessarily solves any problems though, other than I could see that 157 people saw that conversation. I don't know that that is getting at my question or helping me be a better social media manager and science communicator.
So I think really, if 157 people are seeing this conversation, separating your conversation from the one person who is posting, from if you're posting good information, that means 157 people are also seeing that. And so thinking about this as an opportunity, not just to engage with that one person, but social media is social, and we're blasting messages out to the whole world to see. And so really, again, separating that narrative and that personal interaction from what is the question, what is a fair question, what is an opportunity for me to then communicate. If they're drawing a lot of attention, hopefully that's attention that we want and we can engage. Social media, again, is really tricky. It's not the platform for all these conversations, and you have to be really careful where. But thinking about, yeah, maybe one person is really mad and they're putting a lot of mean stuff on there or questioning your work, but lots of other people are seeing it and making other, gathering information. They just may not be, all you see is how many views you get, not a lot of comments or likes from a silent majority.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
And you can always, like, when you're creating content, I think that 15 to 25% more nuance, like, rule is really good for social media. And I try to think about that a lot when we're developing content. How, like, what line can I take this to? Like, can I fit like as much of that 25% in as possible? In very small space, which is hard. But even if I only do it in like one facet of the information that I'm sharing, that's better than no facets.
Yeah, I think, Hannah always leans towards the 15% nuance, and I push for 25, but it's because I lead a little more towards the science. So I see a question from Evan Frost in the chat, which is a good one. A lot of the narratives that we presented are more on the side of, here's a misleading narrative on why you should not cut trees, and therefore you might want to cut more trees. Whereas there's just as many potentially misleading narratives about you should always cut trees and cutting trees is always the answer, but maybe that's also a misleading narrative. And we thought a lot about this, and I think it was a presentation to the Forest Collaboratives Network. And generally, a lot of these forest collaboratives are trying to work with forest managers whose job it is to go out and manage forests actively and cut trees. And we tried at the end to really hammer home on how we are perpetuating a lot of also false narratives and misleading narratives about cutting trees is always the answer. But it was a strategic decision that you picked up on. That wasn't the first thing we said because of constructing our narrative for this presentation. I think it's a completely valid point. And I hope that is one of the main points that we hit home, is how we're vague in general with our language sometimes, and also making assumptions that cutting trees is always the answer without asking questions of ourselves of how forest management, whether it is cutting or burning, is always the answer. There's a lot of weight of evidence, but it's contextualized and depends on your goals and objectives and local ecology, right? What values are you trying to manage for? And how is it going to interact with those values and the ecology? And that's where you should always start, rather than one thing, either cutting trees or leaving trees is always the answer.
One thing, Brett, that you've emphasized to me over and over again is how a lot of our like prioritization processes and things that CFRI is involved in, one of the like most crucial and like kind of like pointed answers that comes out of those processes is indicating where not to do forest management action, like where it's not going to give you like great return on your investment. So
that's where our science and monitoring, like I said in my example about mastication, right? It's kind of like, this isn't the answer everywhere, and sometimes it can make things worse. It's a great tool that can be used appropriately in certain areas, and we should learn more about it. But it was being, I think, overused a little bit as the answer. So yeah, a lot of our work and a lot of science out there does suggest that there's great places to do work, but there's a lot of reasons not to do work in other areas where there's other societal, if we're talking about fire, but there's other reasons to care about forests, for recreation management, for view sheds, for all kinds of things. Karina, go ahead.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for this really, really helpful. And one of the things that I've been thinking about and mulling over a lot to kind of help land managers work through how, in the collaborative that I coordinate, how values might show up in some of these decisions and how we're reflecting the values of the communities or the landowners that we might be working with in our management decisions. One of the things I keep coming back to is practicing. And I think a lot of our communicators within our collaborative and probably across other collaboratives in the state have a lot of experience doing communication, but maybe aren't as practiced in kind of going from like that defensive workplace that sometimes like some of these questions or community questions, feedback can maybe put you in that professional position of trying to defend your work, versus going back and just kind of starting with communicating the values that underlie the decisions that went into eventually the work that was completed. And I wanted to see what you two thought, and anyone else on the call, about helping our communicators practice having some of these difficult conversations and not getting into that defensive mode. And what do you think about that versus, just kind of trying to be off the cuff and managing these decisions and conversations in real time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly the outcome we were hoping from bringing this and putting ourselves out there of starting this conversation, is to continue the conversation. And again, give people some tools, if you don't know all the science and all the citations, just how to start identifying it. But it's a big learning curve. And we've been saying increase pace and scale and do forest treatments and thinning and all these vague words for decades, right? And it's hard to just change overnight. There's papers you know, there's lots of papers coming out now where I'm actively skimming and control finding, and whenever I find those words, changing them. And that's a habit that has changed for me and is changing with CFRI too. But yeah, I don't know, that's something we can discuss too with Katie and Colorado Forest Collaborators Network about continuing venues for these conversations about how can collaborative network partners and others, you know, continue that conversation and learning together.
Learn to be less scared of engaging, but you only get less scared by practicing. And like, I was scared to give this webinar today, and Brett and I have been practicing this conversation for 9 months. So I think it's great to like, think about like ways besides just like reading more things, we can engage better in these conversations. Evan?
Hey, so I really enjoyed the discussion about communicating data and science correctly, and I really value the science in this, but like we're kind of talking about here, data and science can only get you so far when it comes to changing people's minds or influencing their behavior. And oftentimes, you know, like we're saying, you can find data or science or a paper that tells you to do anything. So personally, as a communicator in this and as a visual communicator, I think a lot about like, what are the other tactics that we can use to inform and sway people? And particularly in my work, it's visuals. And so I'm curious to know both from you, Brett and Hannah, and also just from all the other people on here who are experienced in this, but what are, knowing that we need to use more than just data and research, what are some of the more promising techniques that you're seeing to supplement that, or to just, you know, go a different route to get more to the heart than the head? What are the tactics, whether it's like infographics, photography, film, artistic events? I mean, we just had an art and fire festival here in Fort Collins last weekend. Yeah, what are you seeing that's showing promise?
Yeah, I want to hear from the rest of folks who are trying this out in the world. What have you seen that works? Anything?
Well, people are getting their thoughts together. I will just throw out that the science says, sorry, I said I wasn't going to say that, but that, you know, when you can actually engage people personally and have personal conversations is when like minds actually change.
Yeah.
Like that's really the key, and like what places the folks on this call and working in collaborative spaces so strongly.
See, a couple of people popped on, Josh or Megan or Tony. You have anything to add?
I would piggyback off of what Hannah was just saying. I think that in my experience, the one-on-one conversations with people and providing that little 15 to 25% of nuance has been really impactful in my work. And it's sort of, I don't want to railroad your question, Evan, but it sort of brings me to the question that I was thinking of asking, which is that, like, the agency that I work for, the Colorado State Forest Service, is tasked with managing state and private, helping manage state and private lands. And I think that I have a sense that the reason why vague language is often used to describe like the goals and objectives and the background data supporting a various treatment that might be implemented is because there is kind of a working assumption out there that like that's the kind of messaging that like the lay people might want, and that nuance might kind of overwhelm folks and just sort of be like kind of fluff. don't agree with that sentiment, but I think that it's out there. And I guess I'm just wondering if anybody else has felt that, if Brett and Hannah, if you have considered any of that kind of stuff out in the world, thinking about this work.
Anyone else? Counting.
I have to agree with both Hannah and Josh that one-on-one or taking people out into the field is by far my short experience in doing this work, but it's so impactful and so much better than having a conversation on social media. And we also completely underestimate the public in their awareness of these issues, and especially people living in the WUI. And so I think we need to give more credit to the general public and their knowledge of these issues.
I think I'll add two things to your question, Josh. I think the use of terms like treatment and thinning is not as much a fear that nuance will be missed by the public, but just sort of not being aware of who you're talking to and using that language and assuming that people know what you mean when you say that. Because when you're in your office and talking with people, I don't know if even people in the office have, at CFRI, we have different understandings of when someone says treatment. What does that mean? What does that look like? We all get a picture in our head. And I think it's all a little different, but when we use those terms, we're assuming that people are understanding what we're saying. And so like, oh yeah, we're doing a forest treatment over here. You know what I'm talking about, right? And I don't think people do. I think that's where I'm encouraging. I think we need to get a little more specific. And I think my experience, my observation would be it's more that rather than fear of providing nuance. It's lack of knowledge that we need to provide nuance. And then I think just a little bit of a counterpoint to yours statement, Megan, and back to Evan with power of videos, right? One of the comments that someone submitted before this webinar was, I watched the film Elemental and I heard this, that, or the other. And I've heard that in my community that people are talking about the film Elemental and there's all these narratives that have spread out. And films and other kinds of communication can be incredibly powerful to spread messages and contribute to these narratives from all different angles. So I think, yes, I'm not going to deny the individual, but I think also there is a lot of power in social media, movies, visual, graphics, other kinds of communication too. It's hard, right? There's a lot out there. People are getting information from all different angles. Katie, you got a last question or something to wrap us up?
Well, I had put a little comment in the chat. It's not really a question, but just kind of for people who are like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to do one-on-one all the time. I think leaning on your community and leaning on those trusted people can be really helpful. But yeah, I mean, I think all of these little nuggets of advice to help us find nuggets of gold have been really helpful. And I think, yeah, I just want to thank you guys so much for talking to us today. And if anybody has follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. I really liked the idea of continuing this conversation, so I might toy around with some ideas to do that, or if other people have ideas and want to work together to do something like that. That's really what the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network is for, is just constantly continuing conversations that will be useful to help people in their work. So I think just a huge thank you to both of you, and hope everyone has a good weekend. I hope to see most of you at Summit in just 2 short weeks.